strange fruit dangling in the breeze. First, I want to give glory and honor to our God. And I'm so grateful for bringing all of us a mighty, mighty long ways. As we reflect over the poems, prose, stories as it tells the history of our people in this country, it bespeaks to the power and the resistance of one who's been through so much. I would like to first give thanks to Miss Ressie, Mr. Michael Whitaker, and all those who put together this program. And I would also like to thank the sponsors who make it possible, Attorney Johnson and others. I want to give a very, very special shout out to my wife, Dr. Gail Jackson, who's come out this evening, and my partner for a very, very long time. In fact, we have just celebrated our 45th wedding anniversary this past Thanksgiving, into our 46th year. She was my tutor when I was in graduate school at Ohio State. I was first working on a PhD before I started on my MD. And when I went to school, my professor signed me up in a 705 course. Now here I should have been a 400 course, put me in a 705 course. Biochemistry, 705. Well, at the end of the first exam, when the teacher passed the papers back, I looked down at my paper, ooh, I was way underwater. I'm gonna tell you how much I was under. Just take it from me, I was way under. So the teacher said, there are 3 individuals in this class who made perfect papers. In fact, it is so unusual, I'm gonna ask them to stand up. Well, these 2 white guys and this African-American lady stood up. And oh, my mind started ticking fast. So guess what? When the class was over, who was at the door? Hello, young lady. How are you? She says, get away from me. Hold it. So, but I've always been a man of persistence. So I followed her and explained my challenges, and I told her I didn't want to go back to the cotton fields and I needed to pass this course. But nevertheless, it took a lot of work. So I followed her several blocks. And then when she got to her home at 151 Chittenden Avenue, I'll never forget that, I put my hands out like this. I said, after all of that, won't you invite me in for a glass of water? And she did. And the rest is history. 4 children and 8 grandchildren. And guess what? I passed the class. So she is my very, very special partner for a very, very long time. And I also want to thank the Statesboro Bullock Remembrance Coalition, who's doing some extremely important work here in Statesboro and Bullock County as we discuss some very touchy but needy subjects that we should have talked about for a very, very long time. And Reverend Page, Jane Allman Page, who was one of my classmates at the Statesboro High School, who at our 40th class reunion, I received that letter of apology, and you will never know the depths of how it touched my spirit. Because Statesboro High was really a challenging time for all of us. Tonight, I want to discuss briefly, not for a long time, many of the stories that I heard as a lad being raised in the house with my grandparents. I want to talk about lynching briefly. I want to talk about voter suppression, the Ku Klux Klan's, its rise and resurgence, and I want to conclude to talk about what is it that we can do? What is it that we can do, and what should we do? I was born in 1950 in a farmhouse with Dr. Harvey Van Buren, the first black physician here in Bullock County in Statesboro, in attendance. My mother was a 19-year-old who had already had 2 children. My father was a World War II veteran who was sharecropping, and my mom had married at 16 and dad was 25. But 17 months after my birth, something very, very tragic happened that would change the rest of my life. It was during the Korean War, and my father was working in Savannah, Georgia, in a bomb factory, and the bus would come around to these rural communities and pick up these African-American men to work in these factories. Father told me that it was a very cold morning, December the 17th. He said there was frost on the ground and you could hear the cracking of the frost as he was walking down to catch the bus. He remembered thinking, wow, I don't feel like I should go to work today. I really wish I could stay home. However, it was 8 days before Christmas, so he knew that monies would be necessary for Christmas gifts. Mom had got up, fixed his lunch, and when he left, she was standing in front of an open fireplace with a heavy housecoat on, warming. When he got down at the end of the road, he heard a scream and a noise. First, he thought it was hunters because there were many in the area at that time. But because he recognized her voice, he ran back up the hill to the home. Dad said as he walked and ran up the hill, he saw this ball of fire going across the road. Running up to the closest neighbor, a white lady, Mom requested help. She was afraid to come out. She threw a blanket over Mom's head, a quilt, and therefore it was not anything that could help her. So she turned and ran back to the house. And as she was running back, Dad caught her, took off all of her clothing, put the fire out with his hand, and went back to the same lady and requested to take her to the Bullock County Hospital, which was segregated at that time. There was no EMS service, so she was the one that would take Mom to the hospital. So the 3 of us, we were small. I was 17 months, my sister was 2, my brother was 4. Took us all over to our grandmother's house and dropped us off where we would remain. On the way to the hospital, Dad said Blanche Neesmith, who was the lady, a little lady was holding both of those steering wheels, and she was driving. The speedometer was on 100 miles per hour. She was honking the horn. It was a sign of distress. Mom was laying back with Dad, and Mom was saying, Miss Blanche, let me get burned up. And Miss Blanche said, honey, don't say that. Honey, don't say that. They went to the Bullock County Hospital, as it was segregated at the time. You go in the back. And Mom would live 6 hours after that, because if it was this modern time, with all of what we know in medical knowledge, she could have been saved. But what they did is they wrapped gauze around her, and of course that was really the wrong thing because she started swelling. So she was asking, where is my mother, which is her mother? And they said she had been sick, but she is on her way. She kept asking, where is mother? And my grandmother, as she was arriving at the hospital, coming through the front door, Mom asked one last time, where is my mother? And they said, she's on her way. She said, oh well, tell Mom to take care of my children. And she died. And so with that, we came over to live with our grandparents. My grandfather was born in 1892 and my grandmother in 1900. So they were the grandchildren of former slave people. So I came into this tradition of great storytelling found in the Willow Hill community. We were descendants of many of the early white and African American families in Bullock County, including the Hodges, the Donaldsons, the Littles, the Lees, the Nevilles, the Parishes, the Riggs, the Halls, the Love, the Brannons, the Laniers. And our white ancestry is traced back to Ireland, Scotland, and England. So as a young lad, I sat around and listened to all these old people tell these stories. Stories of long ago. Stories that their parents and grandparents had told to them. And I took notice of these stories and had a great, great interest in these stories. They would talk about the Ku Klux Klan. They would talk about the days of slavery. They would talk about sharecropping. They would talk about Jim Crow and so many other topics. So when we think of terror, it is much more than the lynching that our people came through. The whole terror of slavery and its impact had a significant impact on Bullock County, Georgia, and our community. I'm going to tell you just a few of the stories that I heard during slavery era that was told to me that I heard. In fact, I became so interested in these stories that for the past 40 years, I've gone around Bullock County recording the stories of African Americans, many of those still in Bullock County, and many who left as part of the Great Migration, going to elsewhere in the United States, carrying their stories. And I too have recorded that. Additionally, I have been collecting obituaries, which are one of the few places, if you are not a famous person, that your life story is written down. I challenge all of you to respect and honor an obituary. It is the story of somebody's life. And it is so important, and we do have 16,000 and counting copies at the Willow Hill Heritage and Renaissance Center. First person I want to talk briefly about is a woman named Harriet Riggs. And Commissioner Mosley is so glad to see you there because that's your lineage as well. Harriet Riggs was born during slavery in the early 1800s. She is my great-grandmother times 4, great-great-great-grandmother. And what was interesting about her, she was sold on the steps of the Bullock County Courthouse in 1847 in April. We have those documents. She was, what is even interesting about her story, here's a woman, 27 years old, with 4 children, Isaac, Daniel, your ancestors, brother, Ray, Susan, and Peter. Here she is clutching to her children. At the same time, bidders are asking to purchase and separate a family. What is even more interesting about this is that the person who was selling her, a white lady, was her half-sister. And the person who bought her, these were the Nevilles now, and anyone who wants more detail of this story, it is an American story. It is a story of African American people. Please Google Harriet Riggs, the matriarch. We've done extensive research. I have one of my relatives in Washington, D.C. has done the DNA and has connected that back to the white family. So this family is also connected to the Donaldson family. Robert Donaldson, who was a Primitive Baptist minister, started 6 to 7 Primitive Baptist churches here in Bullock County. It was his son, James Donaldson, who married his Dicey Nevilles, who was half-sister to Harriet Riggs, who was sold on the courthouse as well. Now, we're not talking about the current courthouse building. This was in 1847. That was an old log cabin building, the one that Sherman burned down when they came into Bullock County. So that's the one we're talking about, an old log building. And thank God that someone had the knowledge to save all those records out of there when that building was burned down. So what is this story telling us? It tells us that slavery was a very complex time. People were separated. That's terrorism. People were agonizing. All of her children, save one, went to one family. Another child went someplace else. And so the agony, I'm told, that Harriet Riggs had when one of her children went elsewhere. Her brother, half-brother, Thomas, bought all of them except that one. The next story I want to briefly talk about is my great-great-grandmother, Nancy Bennett, born in Virginia in the early 1800s. As a very young child, not even in her teenage years, she was sold into slavery in Emanuel County, Georgia. Never seeing her mother, father, siblings, or anybody else again. She lived to be nearly 100 years old, and every child that she gave birth to were slavery-born children. All of them were born during the era of slavery. And she gave birth to 22 children because they were necessary to work. Can you imagine the horrors of leaving your mother, your father, you as a young child, coming to a strange land and never seeing your parents again? Tell me that's not terrorism. Tell me that's not terrorism. Another story I want to mention briefly, and there is clearly more details to these stories that you can get through our museum at the Willow Hill Heritage and Renaissance Center. I want to talk briefly about Aaron Munley. And Brother Mosley, you know him because you are now deacon of the Banks Creek Primitive Baptist Church, which is the first African American church in Primitive Baptist Church in Bullock County, started in 1879. prior to the starting of that church, African Americans went to the white churches, the Primitive Baptist churches, of which Neville's Creek is the oldest, found in 1790, before Bullock County was founded in 1796. Many of the African Americans, including my ancestors, went to Neville's Creek. Aaron Munling was astute enough to write his own autobiography. And so we know a lot about what happened during that time period. But one of the things that he said was very interesting to me. He says, in the church, there are two nations of people, one for the colored and one for the white. He was convinced that he was called by God to preach, but he was not allowed to preach in the church. So what they said to him, go out and start your own church, and that was the origin of Banks Creek. But Aaron Munling was born in South Carolina in 1848. And in 1856, his mother Hannah, born in 1828, and her children were sold into slavery in Bullock County, Georgia. Their father was left in South Carolina, and these young individuals came over and became a part of the landscape of Bullock County, serving during slavery. One other story I want to mention before I talk a little bit about the lynching is a story my great uncle, Buford Lee, who was a Primitive Baptist minister, told to me. He said that when he was a little boy, he used to be around a lot of these old people that had served during slavery. And one of them was named Emanuel Stewart. And he had a son named Andrew Stewart, and many of Andrew Stewart's daughters were teachers in the Bullock County school system. But Emanuel Stewart told about the time when he witnessed people of color being tied to trees and whipped for minor offenses, dehumanized, and not respected as human beings. But one of the most horrendous stories that we know about is the lynching of Reed and Cato in 1904 in Bullock County, Georgia. What a horrific time. The extrajudicial lynching that happened in spite of having a trial. My grandparents were little children at that time. I heard my grandmother talk so much about the terror of the night riders. She would say that when she was little, she could hear the hoofs of the horses as they were coming down the road. And they would be so fearful. The men would get their guns, go out in the fields and lay on their stomachs. The women would boil potash in their houses and ask the children to be quiet. Shh, don't talk, don't bring attention. And so these are also terroristic times. I also heard during some of my stories when Reed and Cato was being lynched and burned at the stake. When African American people would come that way, the crowd and the mob would say, boy, come here, boy, and force them to put wood on the fire that burned Reed and Cato. How cruel could you be? How cruel could you be? Now, the thing that I want to also reflect in your minds, that it was about 35 years after the end of slavery, 35 to 40 years when Reed and Cato was lynched. We know with the end of slavery, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and Reconstruction, there was great hope. There was great hope for a new beginning for African Americans. And then there was the Hayes Compromise of 1876. There was the end of Reconstruction. There was the rise of the KKK, which had started in Pulaski, Tennessee. And there was a backlash to the progress that African Americans were making, a backlash to the progress they were making. They started killing, and you heard today some of the killing that happened. Braswell in 1886, lynching. And with the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, where many of African Americans started losing their rights to vote, many in right after 1867 voted in Bullock County. We have at the Willow Hill Heritage and Renaissance Center a roster of African Americans who were voters in the Bullock County system. But a backlash. Plessy versus Ferguson, separate which was never equal, and the rise of terror, lynching that happened, that went on and on. And many, many African Americans then lost the right to vote. And then many of the stories that I heard from my ancestors, they had the rise of the KKK again after 1915. And even here in Statesboro, Georgia, the newspaper has several accounts where thousands would come and gather, where the Klans would march in downtown Statesboro, Georgia. The other thing, this whole concept of the Confederacy losing the war, and I really want you to read about what Alexander Stevenson, who was vice president of the Confederacy, who spoke in Savannah in 1861 and defined for us what the Confederacy was about. He made the argument that African Americans were inferior and that whites were superior. He said that in his address. And that was the basis moving forward of much that happened here in Bullock County and in Georgia. And so this whole KKK was a thing of great terror in the African American community. My daughter called me today. She says, "Dad, you are a voice for the ancestors who could not talk or speak because of fear. Fear and danger to their lives." So I want to instill upon all of us that each one of us has a role and a responsibility. And part of that is to document and tell the story. I talked to a Woodrow Jackson who lived to be 103 years old. I do a lot of my oral recordings, and he was one of the gentlemen that I record. I asked about where you were born, where you go to school, and many, many other questions. But one of the questions I also asked, what do you know about the Ku Klux Klan? He stopped instantly and started crying. He said, "Oh, baby, baby, oh, no, I can't talk no more. I can't talk no more. No, I gotta hang up now. Gotta hang up." And I often wondered on several attempts to get him to tell his story. Whatever it was, you have an old man, nearly 100 years old, crying in pain and agony. And that story he took to his graveyard. I could only imagine, because we hear about these 9 individuals that we know about in Bullock County who was lynched, but there are countless others who lost their lives, and their stories are only known to history. And we must, through the work of remembrance in others, tell this story. 2 other points I want to make. One was after World War I in 1919, the red hot summer. Right here next door in Jenkins County, a mob burned down the Coswell Baptist Church. If you don't know that story, please read about it. 3,000 parishioners were meeting for an anniversary, and the church was attacked, and there was mass chaos, and there were deaths. And at that point, at least 2 to 3 African Americans were lynched. A very important story to know. Now, Miss Reverend Page mentioned about going to Statesboro High School. My grandparents were very, very fearful of things that happened, and I really appreciate the mayor who talked about his fear the other day when we was at Georgia Southern, and how this fear became so ingrained into a lot of our parents and grandparents in terms of how they sought to protect us. But I always said when it was time to go to Statesboro High School, somebody's got to do it. I told my grandmother, somebody, she said, oh boy, they're going to burn down our house. She gave me all the reasons why I should not go. I was supposed to go to Portal High, but somebody said Statesboro High had the best education in Bullock County. So I said, that's where I'm going. So I'm a 15-year-old young man out in front of Highway 80, got my thumb out. I hitched a ride to Statesboro High School. And people who knew my determination stopped to give me a ride. Stopped to give me a ride. That little boy. That little boy. And yet, when we got to Statesboro High School, all that means, the name call. When we would go into the cafeteria to eat, they would throw bread at us, call us names. And then, if we go and sit down at the table, everybody would get up and go to another table. So we got together and said, okay, that's how they want to do it. When we walk into the cafeteria today, let's decide which table we want. So we look around. We want that table. Let's all go there because we know who's going to get it. And everybody got up. The next day, we want that table. They would get up. So that was our way of addressing many of the challenges of racism and terrorism and name calling. And yes, you are right, Reverend Page. When I went to school there, we didn't have a lot of money. I worked at the janitor at Statesboro High School at the end of the day. I had to have enough courage in me to do that. And you know how hard that is to work as a janitor, and you go to the student and all the students look at it. But I did it. And then I had to walk home. And on my way walking home, this group of white boys said, there's that inn. Let's get it. So they raced the car to try to run me over, and I always have a big brick in my hand. I held that brick and bent that door, and then I said, oh Lord, I'm out of here now. I ran and jumped over that fence and disappeared. But again, it just speaks to a lot of the challenge. Another point was, in classes, I took advanced courses, but my teachers would always say, now you sure you want to take that? Now you know you can get a job if you take these agriculture courses, if you do this. And I said, no, I want to do Spanish, I want to do geometry, I want to do algebra, I want to do trigonometry. I did all of the tough courses. I remember my Spanish teacher who tried to discourage me. At the end of that year, she said, my Spanish name was Andres. She said, Andres, you have been the best student I have ever had. And why? I studied. And we had to prove ourselves. So what are some of the things that we can do to try to change what is going on. And one other thing is to remember is, I heard someone say, to speak is to act, but also not to speak is to act. We're going to have to move away from this silence we have. Because if we are silent, we are acquiescing to what is going on. Don't we not see the hate and violence and all the vitriol going on in the country now? It is some of the same things that happened after the Civil War during Reconstruction. Do you see now where they want to ban certain things in education? Do you see where they're trying to move things away from our youth? We must accept and acknowledge our history and our past, no matter how bitter it is. We must be open to an open and honest conversation and discussion, especially on race. Remember, there can never be reconciliation if there's not truth. We have to acknowledge the role that white supremacy has played in the history of the United States, being started on the genocide of a race of people and the enslavement of another, of which the wealth of this country was built. We must understand the role of segregation, and we also must know that ordinary people can do great things. People like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, they were just ordinary people who did great things. And so I want to conclude with a poem by Langston Hughes, one of the poems I like, called Mother the Sun. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I've been climbing on, and reaching landings, and turning corners, and sometime going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps, 'cause you find it kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I's still going, honey. I's still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. And thank you all for coming. We have a very small audience, but it's rich.